Big Shaq walks into his own high-end restaurant, disguised as an ordinary customer, only to be humiliated and denied service by a waitress who thinks he doesn't belong. As he watches corrupt staff prioritize the wealthy while pushing others out, something doesn't add up. When he finally unmasks himself, the entire restaurant falls silent, because the real truth is much darker than he ever expected. And now, he's about to burn it all down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The evening air was crisp as Big Shaq stepped out of his black SUV, the neon glow of the Lexington Grill reflecting off the pavement beneath his feet. The restaurant stood as a beacon of luxury and exclusivity, a place where the elite dined in opulence. It was known for its fine dining, impeccable service, and high-profile clientele, and it was his. But lately, something felt off. Shaq had heard the whispers: declining service, unfair treatment, favoritism among guests. At first, he dismissed them as isolated incidents, but then the complaints kept coming. Regulars sensed a change, a shift in the restaurant's warmth, a coldness in the way certain guests were treated. Worse still, rumors surfaced about staff pocketing money under the table, playing favorites, and making paying customers feel unwelcome. Shaq wasn't one to micromanage. He hired people he trusted. But trust could be broken, and if his own staff was mistreating customers, that was personal. Tonight, he wasn't coming in as the owner. He was walking in as a customer. Pulling a faded gray hoodie over his head, Shaq paired it with worn jeans and old sneakers, deliberately dressing like someone who wouldn't turn heads in a high-end establishment. No watch, no suit, no security. He stepped toward the entrance, catching his reflection in the glass doors. The powerful businessman who had graced magazine covers was gone. Tonight, he was just a regular guy looking for a meal. And if the staff had truly forgotten who they worked for, they were about to get a wake-up call. Inside, the restaurant hummed with the quiet energy of wealth, low laughter, the soft clinking of glasses, the distant melody of a grand piano. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. Shaq approached the host stand. A young man, neatly dressed and professional, stood flipping through the reservation list. He offered Shaq a polite but hesitant smile. "Table for one," Shaq said. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" the host asked. "Nope," Shaq replied. "Just looking to grab a bite." There was a brief pause. The host's fingers tapped anxiously against the podium. Shaq caught the way his eyes flickered toward someone behind him before quickly refocusing on the book. "We do have some open tables," the host said, his voice careful. "Right this way." As he led Shaq toward a booth near the back, Shaq took in the restaurant around him, watching, listening. At first, everything seemed normal, but then he saw it. A table by the window, occupied by two young men in expensive suits, laughing loudly as they knocked back whiskey. No menus, no waiting. Within seconds, a waitress appeared, pouring them another round before they even had to ask. A woman at another table, designer bag, sharp nails, effortless wealth, snapped her fingers at a passing server. Within seconds, she was attended to. Shaq narrowed his eyes. So that's how it was. Some guests were treated like royalty. Others, invisible. The host placed a menu on the table. "Your server will be right with you." Shaq nodded, watching as the young man hurried away too quickly. And then, she arrived. The problem. Tall, mid-30s, sharp features, an expression of pure arrogance. Her uniform was spotless, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail. But the moment her eyes landed on Shaq, her lip curled in disdain. Her name tag read, Veronica. "Can I help you?" she asked, arms crossed, not even bothering with fake politeness. Shaq glanced at the menu. "Yeah, I'll have the ribeye, medium rare, and a bottle of still water." She didn't write anything down. Instead, she let out a short, dry laugh. "Mm-hmm," she mused, tapping her nails against the tray. "You sure you can afford that?" Silence. A few nearby guests turned their heads, sensing the tension. Shaq lifted his gaze slowly, meeting hers. Oh, so that's how this was going to go. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Why? You offering to pay for it?" A few snickers came from nearby tables, but Veronica wasn't fazed, If anything, she looked amused. "No," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I just think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Somewhere like, where?" Her smile sharpened. "I don't know. A place that serves burgers, fries, something a little more in your budget." This time the silence was louder. Across the room, the two men in suits grinned, watching the scene unfold like it was a show. The young waiter by the bar avoided eye contact. The bartender froze mid-pour. Shaq's smirk faded. His voice dropped lower, steady, controlled. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "You're refusing to serve me?" Veronica shrugged. "I just think this restaurant is a little out of your league." Shaq stared at her, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of her words sink in. She had no idea who she was talking to. And that was about to be a very big problem. Shaq let the tension hang. Then, he reached up and pulled off his cap. The entire restaurant froze. The young waiter at the bar? His eyes widened with recognition. The hostess at the front? She gasped. Even the bartender, who had been drying glasses absent-mindedly, stopped mid-motion. And Veronica? She paled, because she finally understood. The man she had insulted, humiliated, dismissed, was the owner of the restaurant. Shaq's voice was calm, steady, lethal. "You just refused to serve the man who signs your paycheck." The entire restaurant fell silent. And just like that, the power had shifted. The air inside the Lexington Grill had changed. Conversations continued at nearby tables, but the warmth was gone. Laughter from the bar sounded forced. The clinking of fine crystal glasses had become sporadic. Everything felt like background noise to the tension building beneath the surface. Shaq leaned back against the plush leather booth, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Veronica stood confidently, arms crossed. A smug smirk stretched across her face, as if she had already won whatever twisted game she was playing. "You look confused," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe I should spell it out for you." Shaq exhaled slowly. "By all means." Veronica tapped her manicured nails against the small order pad tucked into her apron. "This is a high-class establishment. Our guests expect an elevated dining experience." She gestured toward the suited men by the window, the designer-clad women sipping wine, the polished clientele scattered throughout the room. "And we don't exactly cater to walk-ins." Shaq's gaze drifted across the room. Not a single person looked like him. Not one was dressed down the way he was. He had walked in deliberately stripped of everything that made him recognizable. Just a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. And now, he was being judged for it. "That so?" he mused, voice steady. Veronica's smirk widened. "It is, and we don't want to waste a table on someone who might struggle with the check." A few nearby guests turned their heads, mild curiosity flickering in their expressions. Some looked amused, others looked uncomfortable. By the bar, a young waiter stood frozen, gripping a tray, his gaze darting toward the empty manager's office. Shaq took note of that immediately. The manager was missing. And yet, Veronica spoke with complete authority, as if she ran the place. Shaq's fingers tapped idly against the table. "So just to be clear, you're saying I can't afford to eat here?" Veronica let out a short, cold laugh. "I'm saying it's unlikely, no offense." "None taken," Shaq replied smoothly. He studied her, his expression neutral. "You always talk to customers like this?" "Only the ones who don't belong." The words landed hard, not just between them, but across the entire restaurant. Conversations stalled. A few guests openly watched, intrigued by the unfolding confrontation. The suited men by the window smirked, one shaking his head as if he had seen this before. Shaq wasn't angry. Not yet. He was calculating. And right now, Veronica was making his job very easy. Shaq nodded toward the suited men by the window. "Like them?" Veronica hesitated, just a flicker of unease before masking it with another smirk. The man in the navy blue suit, the one drinking whiskey like water since Shaq arrived, lifted his glass in a mock toast. His gold watch caught the light. His diamond cufflinks flashed as he leaned back lazily. Shaq had recognized him immediately. Donovan King, wealthy, arrogant, a notorious fraud in the business world. And yet, here he was, served without question, without hesitation. Meanwhile, the owner of the restaurant was being treated like trash. Shaq's jaw tightened, but his face remained impassive. "He a regular?" he asked. Veronica's smirk faltered for the briefest second before she forced it back into place. "Mr. King is a valued guest," Shaq hummed. "Is that right?" "You could say he and I have an understanding," Veronica said smoothly. Shaq saw it then. The way her shoulders squared, the slight air of entitlement, the way she spoke as if she was untouchable. She wasn't just a bad waitress. She was running something here, and Donovan, he was part of it. This wasn't about bad service. It was about power. Veronica had influence, deciding who was treated like royalty and who was pushed out. And Donovan, he benefited from it. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "All right, I get it now." Veronica arched a brow. "Get what?" Shaq slid his chair back slightly, slow and deliberate. "This place isn't about good food or service. It's about control." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Shaq ignored her. He turned his gaze toward the young waiter at the bar, the one who had looked uncomfortable from the moment he walked in. Their eyes met, and in that split second, the kid looked guilty. That was all Shaq needed. Something was wrong here. And now, he was going to find out exactly what it was. Shaq leaned forward, voice just low enough for Veronica to hear. "Tell me something," he murmured. "You think you can get away with this?" Veronica blinked, caught off guard for the first time. "Excuse me?" Shaq's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're not just refusing to serve me. You're running a game here, aren't you?" He nodded toward Donovan. "Guys like him? They get special treatment. People like me? You try to push out." Veronica's smirk returned, but there was something colder behind it now. "And what if I am?" Shaq studied her for a moment, then exhaled slowly. He pushed back his chair and stood, adjusting his hoodie. "All right," he said casually. "You've made your point." Veronica's smirk widened in triumph. "Good, then I'll have to ask you to leave." Shaq nodded once. "Sure, just one last thing." And then, he reached up and pulled off his cap. The entire restaurant froze. The young waiter at the bar? His eyes went wide with recognition. The hostess at the front? She gasped. The bartender, who had been drying glasses absent-mindedly? He stopped mid-motion. And Veronica? She paled, because she finally understood. The man she had insulted, humiliated, dismissed, was the owner of the restaurant? Shaq's voice was calm, steady, lethal. "You just refuse to serve the man who signs your paycheck." The entire restaurant fell silent. And just like that, the power had shifted. A heavy silence lingered in the Lexington Grill like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The restaurant, moments ago filled with quiet conversations and the clinking of fine crystal glasses, now felt unnaturally still. All eyes were locked onto Big Shaq, who had just revealed his identity. Veronica, the waitress who had been so smug only seconds earlier, stood frozen in place. The color had drained from her face, her confidence flickering like a candle struggling against the wind. The realization had hit her hard. The man she had been mocking, humiliating, and attempting to push out wasn't just a regular customer. He was the owner of the restaurant. The tension was thick, but Shaq didn't say anything. He just let the weight of the moment sink in. He wasn't here to explode in anger or demand apologies. He was here for something much bigger. And right now, something told him this wasn't just about bad service. Something deeper was happening. Shaq's mind raced as he took in the reactions around him. Some of the staff members looked horrified, like they had been caught in something they didn't sign up for. Others, especially Veronica, seemed to be calculating, trying to decide how to salvage this situation. And then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed a young waiter lingering near the bar. The kid couldn't have been older than 21, with a thin frame and nervous energy radiating off him in waves. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his hands fidgeting at his sides as he cast quick, uncertain glances toward Veronica. There was something off about his posture, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. Shaq made eye contact with him, and for a moment, the kid hesitated. Then, after a quick glance around to make sure no one was paying attention, he took a step closer, just within earshot. And then he whispered, "Don't push too hard. You don't know what you're dealing with." Shaq's muscles tensed. That single sentence confirmed everything. This wasn't just one bad waitress being rude. This wasn't just poor management. Something else was going on behind the scenes. Shaq didn't react immediately. He just nodded slightly, acknowledging the warning. But his mind was already racing, piecing together the little details he had been noticing since he walked through the door. There was a pattern here, and he was about to figure it out. Veronica seemed to snap out of her daze, her shoulders squaring, her lips pressing into a tight smirk as she tried to reclaim control of the situation. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "if you wanted to see how things run when the boss isn't around, congratulations. You've had the full experience." Shaq leaned back slightly, studying her. "You think this is funny?" She shrugged. "You showed up like a nobody. You got treated like one. You can't be mad at the system you designed." Shaq didn't blink. "That so?" Veronica smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was a challenge. She was daring him to push further, daring him to make this a bigger scene. And that's when he knew she wasn't afraid. She had no fear about being fired, no concern about losing her job, which meant she had power here. And that was the biggest red flag of all. Shaq decided to test something. Without saying a word, he picked up the menu again and flagged down another waiter, one who had been actively avoiding his gaze this entire time. The guy hesitated, his jaw tensing slightly before he forced himself to approach the table. "Yes, sir," he said, voice carefully neutral. Shaq casually pointed to the ribeye steak and mashed potatoes on the menu. "I'll take this, medium rare, and a side of roasted asparagus." The waiter's expression didn't change. "Of course, sir. Anything to drink?" "Just water," Shaq said. The waiter nodded, jotting something down on his notepad, before quickly turning and walking straight toward the kitchen. Shaq didn't miss the way Veronica watched him go. And he definitely didn't miss the smirk that crept onto her face, like she already knew what was going to happen next. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. Shaq sat there, his patience slowly thinning, as the restaurant continued to function around him as if nothing was wrong. His food never came, not even a glass of water. Across the room, he watched as Donovan King, the wealthy, arrogant, valued guest, laughed loudly as a waiter delivered an entire bottle of imported whiskey to his table. The blonde woman from earlier? She snapped her fingers again, and within seconds, a server appeared to refill her drink. But Shaq? Shaq had been sitting there for 20 minutes and he had been completely ignored. He slowly exhaled through his nose. "All right, now we have a real problem." Shaq carefully observed the flow of the restaurant. The same people were getting quick, effortless service. The same people were being deliberately ignored. It wasn't random. There was a system in place. And the more Shaq watched, the more he realized this wasn't just favoritism. This was sabotage. Someone was picking and choosing who got to feel welcome here. And more importantly, someone was picking and choosing who didn't. He turned his attention back to the nervous young waiter who had warned him earlier. The kid was standing by the drink station, pretending to refill glasses, but stealing quick glances toward Shaq's table. He knew what was happening. Shaq could see it in the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped the tray a little too tightly. So, Shaq did the only thing that made sense. He stood up. A few heads turned as he made his way toward the bar, moving slowly, deliberately, until he was standing right beside the kid. The waiter swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his gaze forward. Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "My food ain't coming, is it?" The kid flinched. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. "Who's behind this?" The kid hesitated, then barely above a whisper he murmured, "Not here." Shaq studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his table. Veronica was watching him, her smirk wider now, as if she had already decided he had lost. Shaq sat back down, stretching his legs out slightly, making himself comfortable. "Problem, boss?" Veronica taunted. Shaq smiled slowly. "Nah," he said. "I'm just getting started." This wasn't just a case of bad service anymore. This was a power play, a game. And what Veronica didn't realize? She had just made a mistake. Because if there was one thing Big Shaq didn't lose at, it was the game. The air inside the Lexington Grill had shifted. The once lively hum of conversation had faded, replaced by hushed murmurs and uncertain glances. Big Shaq sat at his table, waiting for food that was never coming. He had watched as other patrons were served effortlessly, their meals arriving within minutes while he was ignored, treated like an outsider in his own establishment. Enough. Across the room, Veronica, the restaurant's most arrogant waitress, leaned casually against the hostess stand, her smirk radiating power. She had dismissed him, humiliated him, made it clear he didn't belong here, without realizing who she was dealing with. Shaq exhaled, stretching his fingers against the tabletop. The young waiter's warning still echoed in his mind. "Don't push too hard. You don't know what you're dealing with." But Shaq did know. And now, it was time to end this. Shaq pushed back his chair, the screech against the marble floor cutting through the delicate background music. Heads turned. Conversations stalled. He stood, adjusting his hoodie, his movements slow, measured. No yelling, no scene, just undeniable presence. His eyes locked onto Veronica, his voice calm but unyielding. "I'm gonna ask you one more time, where's my food?" Veronica laughed, shaking her head. "Oh, you're still here." She glanced around, smirking. "I figured you'd get the message and leave by now." The tension sharpened. A few guests exchanged glances. Some of the staff froze, bracing for impact. Shaq didn't blink. "What message?" Veronica's smirk deepened. "That people like you don't belong here." A ripple of unease spread through the restaurant. A bartender paused mid-pour. The young waiter who had warned Shaq earlier clenched his fists. Shaq let the words sink in. Then, he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not amused. The kind of smile that came before something irreversible happened. And then, with one slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and pulled off his cap. Gasps rippled through the restaurant like a shockwave. A man at a nearby table muttered, "No way." The bartender's hand froze, whiskey spilling over the rim. The hostess covered her mouth, eyes wide with recognition. Veronica's smirk? Gone. Shaq took a step forward, watching as the realization crashed down on her. "You're refusing to serve the owner of this restaurant?" The words landed hard, echoing in the stunned silence. The guests were staring now, curiosity turning into something more. This wasn't just a bad interaction anymore. This was a reckoning. Veronica blinked, stunned. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She had no idea what to do. Shaq let the silence stretch, then spoke again, louder, so everyone could hear. "Because that's what just happened, right? You refused to serve me. You insulted me. You made it clear that I don't belong here." Veronica swallowed hard. Shaq turned to the rest of the staff, the waiters, the bartenders, the hostess, the young waiter who had tried to warn him. Some looked guilty, others looked terrified. "How long has this been going on?" Shaq's voice carried across the room. "How long has this restaurant been picking and choosing who deserves good service? How long has someone like her been running the show instead of the actual management?" No one answered. No one dared. Shaq turned back to Veronica, shaking his head. "You were real comfortable, weren't you?" His tone was almost amused. "Real comfortable deciding who gets treated like a person and who doesn't, because you thought no one would stop you." Veronica stiffened, her jaw tightening. She was scrambling now, searching for a way out. But there was no way out. From across the restaurant, a wealthy customer, Donovan King, watched the scene unfold like a private show. Shaq turned to him, eyes narrowing. "And you," he said. "Enjoying the perks?" Donovan smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. I don't know what you're talking about, mate. Shaq scoffed. Sure you don't. Because as long as people like her take care of you, you don't care who gets stepped on, right? Donovan just chuckled. It's just business. Shaq shook his head. Not anymore. Suddenly, a shuffle from the back of the restaurant. The manager had finally appeared. A man who had been conveniently missing all night. His face was pale, his movements stiff, like he had walked into his own funeral. Shaq turned to him. Tell me something. The manager hesitated. Sir, Who runs this restaurant? Shaq's voice was deadly calm. The manager swallowed. You do, sir. Shaq nodded slowly. That's what I thought. And then, without breaking eye contact, he pointed at Veronica. Fire her. The restaurant erupted. Gasps. Whispers. Some guests even clapped softly, like they were watching a courtroom drama unfold in real life. Veronica's eyes widened. What? Shaq didn't look at her. You heard me, he said to the manager. She's done. Right now. The manager didn't argue. He just nodded. Veronica, he said stiffly, you need to leave. Veronica's mask shattered. Are you serious? You're firing me because some... She cut herself off, biting back the insult she had been about to throw. Shaq finally looked at her. You thought you were untouchable, he said, voice conversational, almost casual. You thought no one would notice what you were doing here. But I own this place. And you just made sure your last shift was your worst one. Her face twisted with rage. But she knew it was over. She ripped off her apron, threw it onto the floor, and stormed toward the exit, pushing past stunned guests and whispering staff. Shaq didn't watch her leave. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned to the remaining employees, some still frozen in shock, others watching him with something close to relief. He let his voice carry across the room. We're gonna fix this. A beat of silence. Starting tonight. And just like that, the power had shifted. For good. The restaurant erupted the moment Veronica stormed out. Gasps and whispers spread through the room like wildfire, customers exchanging shocked glances, while staff members stood frozen in place. The once elegant dining room, with its soft candlelight and pristine white tablecloths, now felt like a crime scene. One where the guilty parties had just been exposed. Shaq stood in the center of it all, unshaken, his gaze sweeping across the restaurant. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes on him. Some filled with curiosity, others with guilt, but most with fear. No one had expected this, especially not Veronica. The tension wasn't over yet. As the last echoes of the front doors slamming shut faded, the true unraveling began. The staff looked horrified, their faces a mixture of shock and dread. Some of them stood stiffly behind the bar. Others lingered near the kitchen entrance, their hands gripping trays like lifelines. The young waiter who had warned Shaq earlier looked visibly relieved, but also terrified. And then, a voice cut through the silence like a dull blade. This is a misunderstanding. Shaq turned, his eyes locking onto the assistant manager, a woman in her 40s with perfectly ironed clothes and a forced smile that looked a little too tight. Her voice wobbled slightly, but she quickly masked it, straightening her posture. Sir, she said, stepping forward, I think there's been some confusion. Veronica had a... She hesitated, searching for the right words. Bad attitude, but I assure you, our service standards are intact. This was just a lapse in judgment. Shaq raised an eyebrow. A lapse in judgment? His voice was calm, but firm. A lapse in judgment is forgetting someone's drink order. This? He gestured around the restaurant. This is a pattern, and I want to know why. The assistant manager opened her mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. He turned, addressing the staff now, his voice carrying across the dining room. Why has the service here been going to hell? His gaze landed on the nearest waiter, who flinched slightly. Why are customers being treated like they don't belong? The silence was deafening. His eyes swept over the employees, some avoiding his gaze, others shifting uncomfortably in their spots. And then he asked the question that broke everything open. Where is the real manager? A single cough broke the silence. Then, a shuffle of feet. The assistant manager's composed mask cracked, her lips pressing into a thin line. Shaq narrowed his eyes, and then the truth started unraveling. The assistant manager wasn't the real manager. The actual general manager, the man Shaq had hired to run this place, hadn't been seen in weeks. And it wasn't because he had quit. It was because he had been pushed out. Shaq's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Explain," he said, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something sharp. The assistant manager faltered. He was making mistakes. Customers weren't happy with him. Some of the staff, well, they felt he wasn't handling things properly. Shaq's gaze darkened. "So you just got rid of him?" She hesitated. "Not exactly." "You forced him out," Shaq interrupted, his voice cutting through the excuse. A ripple of unease ran through the staff. Some employees looked away, their jaws tightening, as if they had been waiting for someone else to say it first. And that's when Shaq saw it, the flicker of guilt in their expressions. There was more to this. A lot more. Shaq exhaled slowly, trying to process the scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about bad customer service. This wasn't just one waitress on a power trip. This was an inside job. Someone had orchestrated all of this. The poor treatment of certain guests, the preferential treatment of others, the bribes, the silence among employees, the forced removal of the actual manager. And the worst part? The ones who tried to report it were either threatened or fired. Shaq clenched his jaw. So that's why no one had spoken up. They were afraid. The assistant manager knew she had lost control of the situation. She took a shaky breath, then tried one last time to regain footing. "Sir," she said, voice softer now. "I understand this is a shock, but I can assure you—" Shaq's hand shot up, silencing her instantly. "Don't," he said. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't need to yell to command attention. Everyone in the restaurant had already stopped breathing. Shaq turned toward the rest of the staff, his tone firm but direct. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" The room stayed silent. The young waiter from earlier shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the assistant manager like he was waiting for permission to speak. Shaq noticed, and he'd had enough. He turned toward the assistant manager. "Step aside." She stiffened. Now." She hesitated, but one look at Shaq's steely expression, and she moved. The young waiter looked up, surprised. Shaq nodded at him. "Tell me the truth." The kid swallowed hard, then finally, spoke. "Sir." His voice was shaky, but he forced himself to continue. "Veronica and a few others. They were taking bribes." A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the guests. Shaq's eyes didn't move from the waiter. "Go on." The waiter licked his lips, clearly nervous, but now that he had started, it was pouring out. They were prioritizing certain guests, like Donovan King and his friends. They'd comp their meals, let them get away with treating the staff like trash, and in return they'd get payments, extra tips, cash under the table. Shaq's blood ran cold. The kid hesitated, then lowered his voice. And if anyone questioned it, they were either threatened or fired. Shaq had heard enough. His entire body tensed, his jaw locked, his patience officially gone. He turned back to the assistant manager, his tone like stone. "You let this happen?" The assistant manager didn't speak. "You let people like Veronica and Donovan King run my restaurant?" No answer. "You let good employees get fired while the corrupt ones stayed?" Her throat bobbed, but she still didn't answer. Shaq's expression darkened. "Then you're done too." The restaurant exploded. A mixture of gasps, whispers, and stunned disbelief rippled through the space as the assistant manager's face drained of color. Her lips parted, as if she were about to argue, but the words never came, because there was nothing to say. Shaq turned to the young waiter. "What's your name?" The kid blinked, surprised. "Tyler, sir." Shaq nodded. "Tyler, you still want to work here?" Tyler hesitated for half a second, then nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Shaq smirked. "Good." Then, with calculated finality, he turned back to the assistant manager. "Get out." She opened her mouth, but froze when she saw his eyes. She had lost. She knew it. And as she turned and walked out of the restaurant, the weight of everything that had been built on corruption finally collapsed. The cleanup will start tonight. And tomorrow? The Lexington Grill would never be the same again. The restaurant was still reeling from the shock. Veronica was gone. The assistant manager had been fired. The corrupt scheme of favoritism, bribes, and intimidation had been dragged into the light, and now, the Lexington Grill stood in uneasy silence. The staff was shaken, the customers whispering, the weight of a long-buried truth settling over the space like a heavy fog. Big Shaq stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, his mind racing. He should have felt relief. But something wasn't sitting right. This was too neat, too clean. Veronica had been a problem, but she wasn't the mastermind. She had been confident, too confident. Like she knew she had protection, like she wasn't worried about consequences because someone had her back. So who had been pulling the strings? And then, the doors swung open. The actual general manager walked in. And the moment Shaq saw his face, he knew. A hush spread across the restaurant as the manager strode inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, his usual air of authority strangely absent. The staff turned to look at him, eyes wide with something close to dread. Shaq narrowed his gaze. This man, Lucas Harrington, was supposed to be the one running the Lexington Grill. A seasoned professional, well-respected in the industry, someone Shaq had trusted with his name, his reputation, his business. Yet here he was, standing in the doorway, looking more like a man walking into his own execution than a boss returning to his restaurant. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his eyes flickered between the staff, the customers, and finally, Big Shaq. And in that moment, Shaq saw it. Not relief, not shock, but guilt. His stomach turned. Oh, hell no. Lucas took a deep breath, adjusting his cufflinks as if trying to regain his composure. I heard there was an incident, he said, his voice smooth, professional, too professional. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. An incident? That's what he was calling this? The man had been absent for weeks, left his employees to run the place into the ground, let customers get mistreated, let the corruption grow unchecked, and now he strolled in acting like this was some minor misunderstanding. Nah, Shaq had seen enough. You heard there was an incident? Shaq repeated, his voice dangerously low. Lucas hesitated. He glanced toward the now empty spot where Veronica had stood just moments ago. His lips pressed into a thin line. I see you've already made some changes. Shaq stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Where have you been? Lucas met his gaze. Handling other business. Shaq let the silence stretch between them. Other business, he echoed. Lucas nodded. I trusted my team to maintain the restaurant's high standards in my absence. He glanced around. Clearly there have been some missteps. Shaq could feel the rage simmering beneath his skin. Missteps? This wasn't some minor oversight. This was a full-blown takeover of his restaurant by corrupt employees who had turned it into their personal cash machine. And Lucas was acting like this was news to him? Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then in a voice so quiet it made the room feel smaller, he asked, You knew, didn't you? Lucas didn't react immediately. But the flicker in his eyes, the slight tensing of his shoulders, it was all Shaq needed. He had known all along. And suddenly, everything clicked. The bribes, the intimidation, the unchecked power Veronica had been flaunting. She hadn't been working alone. She had been protected. And Lucas had been the one protecting her. The realization hit like a thunderclap. Lucas had been taking bribes, just like Veronica and the others. He had allowed this corruption to fester, not because he was incompetent, but because he was profiting from it. Shaq's hands curled into fists at his sides. How much? Lucas blinked. What? How much were they paying you? Shaq asked, his voice like steel. Lucas hesitated. It was only for a second, but Shaq caught it. The room felt 10 degrees colder. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I trusted you, he said, his voice quieter now but no less lethal. I gave you everything. And you let this place turn into a joke. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. Shaq, Shut up. The entire restaurant went dead silent. Lucas froze. Shaq was done. You let them treat my customers like garbage, Shaq continued, stepping closer, his voice low but filled with barely contained rage. You let them take money under the table, let good employees get fired, let people like Veronica think they ran this place. He exhaled, shaking his head. And what? You just looked the other way while the cash rolled in? Lucas opened his mouth, but Shaq cut him off. You're fired. Lucas's eyes went wide. Wait. You're fired, Shaq repeated, voice sharp enough to cut glass. A stunned gasp rippled through the staff. The customers sat frozen, wide-eyed, watching what was undoubtedly the most dramatic moment the Lexington Grill had ever seen. Lucas took a step forward, panic creeping into his voice. Shaq, be reasonable. You can't just... You think I can't? Shaq shot back, voice deadly calm. I own this place, and I just did. Lucas's face twisted. You don't understand how this business works. I was doing what was best. Best for who? Shaq challenged. Because it sure as hell wasn't the customers, wasn't the honest employees. The only people who benefited were you and the ones lining your pockets. Lucas's jaw locked, but Shaq wasn't done. You let greed run this place. You let selfishness and power games replace actual service. And now? Shaq exhaled, his tone like thunder before a storm. You're gonna live with the consequences. Lucas's face went red with fury, but he had no argument, no defense, because he had already lost. Shaq turned to the staff, his gaze sweeping over them. For anyone else who was part of this, who took bribes, who looked the other way, who thought they could run this place like a private club. He let his voice linger, letting the weight of his words settle. You can leave right now. The room held its breath. Seconds ticked by. And then, one of the waiters took off his apron and quietly walked toward the exit. Then another. Then two more. They left without a word. The rest? They stayed. Shaq nodded, turning to the bartender, the hostess, the remaining servers, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up. This place is going to be different now, he said. No more corruption, no more games, no more customers getting treated like they don't belong. He met their eyes. If you're willing to do this the right way, then you stay. But if you're just waiting for the next scam, his voice hardened. Get out now. No one moved. The ones who hadn't been involved looked at him with something close to relief. The ones who had, they were already gone. Lucas stood in place, his expression dark, his breath heavy. Shaq turned to him one last time. I trusted you. His voice wasn't angry now, just disappointed. Get the hell out of my restaurant. Lucas swallowed hard, then, without another word, walked out. And just like that, the last piece of rot had been removed. The Lexington Grill had fallen apart tonight. But now, Shaq was finally going to rebuild it the right way. The Lexington Grill had been stripped bare of its illusions. What once stood as a pristine, high-end establishment, a place of wealth, exclusivity, and power, had been revealed for what it truly was, a house rotting from the inside out. But tonight, that changed. The corruption had been exposed, its leaders, Veronica, Lucas, and their loyalists, removed. The weight of deception that had festered in the restaurant for months, maybe longer, had finally lifted. Now, as Big Shaq stood in the center of the dining room, facing the employees who remained, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. The restaurant was eerily quiet, the tension still thick in the air. The last of the corrupt employees had walked out, some looking ashamed, others defiant. Lucas had left without another word, his shoulders stiff, his face a mask of barely restrained fury. But now, the ones who had stayed, the bartenders, the kitchen staff, the servers who hadn't been part of the scheme, stood together, uncertain but relieved. Shaq let the silence sit for a moment. Then, he exhaled sharply and turned to the remaining employees. That's done, he said, voice steady. Now we fix this. For a long moment, no one spoke. The staff exchanged looks, hesitant but expectant. The shift had been so sudden, A place once ruled by intimidation and greed was now open. A young employee finally stepped forward. It was Tyler, the waiter who had risked warning Shaq earlier. His hands were still trembling, his eyes darting around the room, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. Instead, Shaq looked at him directly. "You were the first to speak up," Shaq said. "Why?" Tyler swallowed hard. "Because I couldn't do it anymore." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't back down. "I saw good people get fired. I saw customers get pushed out just because they didn't fit the image. I saw money exchanging hands between the staff, and..." He hesitated, glancing toward the door where Lucas had left. "The people in charge. And every time I thought about saying something, I'd look at what happened to the last person who tried, and..." His breath hitched. "I was scared," he admitted. "We all were." Shaq's jaw tightened. He glanced at the rest of the staff. "That true?" A few nods. Others looked away, ashamed. Shaq ran a hand down his face. He couldn't blame them. Fear had kept them silent, kept them complacent. But tonight, they weren't afraid anymore. "You got a choice," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "All of you." The room held its breath. "You can walk away right now," Shaq continued. "No hard feelings, no questions. If you don't think you can work here the right way, if you just want to be done with this mess, you can leave." Silence. "Or," Shaq said, scanning their faces, "you stay. And we build this place from the ground up, the right way. No bribery, no favoritism, no intimidation. A place where customers get treated with respect, no matter what they look like, no matter how much money they have. A place where staff gets to do their jobs without being afraid of who's watching. A place where we take back everything those frauds stole from us." A pause. "Your choice." Tyler took a shaky breath, then squared his shoulders. "I want to stay." Shaq nodded. "All right." He looked at the others. "What about the rest of you?" The response was immediate. "I'm in." "Me too. We want this place back." A ripple of determination spread through the staff. The fear that had clung to them for months was gone, replaced by something stronger. Shaq let out a slow breath, nodding. "Then let's get to work." And just like that, the Lexington Grill was his again. The staff wasted no time. Some employees moved to the kitchen, already checking inventory, ensuring the food that had been ignored all night was still good. Others began resetting the tables, wiping away the tension that had settled in the room, replacing it with purpose. The bartender tossed out the drinks left behind by Donovan King and his cronies, scrubbing down the counters as if he could erase their presence altogether. Tyler took charge of the front, reorganizing the service schedule, speaking with the remaining hosts and waitstaff. His hands were still shaking, but his voice was strong. Shaq watched all of it unfold, and for the first time all night he felt something close to peace. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time to undo what had been done here. But the worst of it, the cancer that had been eating away at his restaurant, was gone. And now, the Lexington Grill was about to become something better. As the night wound down, Shaq sat at one of the bar stools, watching as the restaurant took its first breath of freedom. Tyler walked over, setting a plate in front of him. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Ribeye," Tyler said, smirking. "Medium rare." Shaq blinked, then let out a laugh, a real one. "Damn," he muttered. "Took long enough." Tyler grinned. Had to make sure the kitchen wasn't still under Veronica's spell. Shaq shook his head, cutting into the steak. And as he took the first bite, he realized it tasted right again. Word spread fast. The next day, news leaked about what had gone down at the Lexington Grill. Social media exploded with videos of the confrontation, of Shaq standing tall as he exposed the corruption that had tainted his business. By noon, the headline was everywhere. "Big Shaq cleans house. Lexington Grill gets a second chance." Customers who had once been pushed away returned, curious and hopeful. They were met with a completely new atmosphere, one where they were greeted with a genuine welcome, where service came with a smile, where every guest was treated with respect, not just the ones with deep pockets. Within a week, reservations tripled. Within a month, the Lexington Grill had become the most talked about restaurant in the city, not because of its corruption, but because of its rebirth. The ones who had been part of the old system, they were long gone, left to fend for themselves in the mess they had created. And Shaq? He had his restaurant back, not just in name, but in spirit. That night, Shaq stood in the middle of the bustling dining room, the sounds of laughter, conversation, and genuine hospitality surrounding him. Tyler passed by, catching his eye. "How's it feel?" he asked. Shaq looked around, then smiled. "Feels like home. And for the first time in a long, long time, it finally was." What happens when power falls into the wrong hands? Big Shaq's restaurant was nearly destroyed by greed, but he took it back, and now it's stronger than ever. Would you have seen the signs? Would you have spoken up, or stayed silent out of fear? Watch the full story now to uncover the truth, the betrayal, and the ultimate redemption. Don't miss this shocking transformation.